The city of New York glowed that evening. Skyscrapers stood tall against the fading sun, their glass windows reflecting streaks of gold and crimson. Inside one of the tallest towers, preparations were underway for a gathering like no other. A billionaire's business summit, a place where power shook hands with pride, and wealth spoke louder than words. Among the sea of limousines and luxury cars pulling up to the grand entrance, there came a modest black sedan. It drew no attention, no cameras flashed, and no reporters ran toward it. Out stepped a woman in her mid-40s, tall, graceful, and dressed in a simple navy blue gown. She wore no diamond necklace, no glittering earrings, no designer bag. Her hair was tied neatly, and her face, though calm, carried the depth of someone who had lived through storms and survived. Her name was Amara Johnson. For many in the city, the name meant nothing. But for those who truly understood power, real power, Amara's name was whispered in circles of respect. She was not the type to appear on magazine covers or show off her wealth at charity galas. She built her empire quietly, brick by brick, rising from the ashes of hardship. To the outside world, she looked like an ordinary woman. But behind that calm gaze was a fortune larger than most could ever imagine. As Amara stepped into the glittering lobby of the tower, heads turned briefly. But they didn't turn in admiration. Some frowned, some raised eyebrows, and some whispered under their breath. To them, she didn't look like she belonged here. She wasn't draped in designer brands. She wasn't accompanied by assistants or bodyguards. She didn't shine with the arrogance that usually walked into such a gathering. But Amara didn't care. She had not come to be seen. She had come to watch. The grand ballroom was alive with conversation. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, pouring golden light on tables lined with champagne glasses and gold-plated cutlery. Men in tailored suits and women in gowns where thousands laughed loudly, bragged about deals, and compared their latest acquisitions. Amara quietly walked to a corner table and took her seat, unnoticed by most. She carried herself with the dignity of a queen, even though no one in that room treated her like one. And that was the irony. Here sat a woman worth billions. A woman whose companies stretched across technology, healthcare, and real estate. A woman who had given scholarships to children, built hospitals in forgotten neighborhoods, and fed families during crises. Yet, tonight, in this hall filled with so-called power, she was invisible. But invisibility was her choice. And soon, everyone in that room would know why. While Amara sat quietly at her table, the atmosphere in the ballroom suddenly shifted. A murmur rippled through the crowd, followed by applause that wasn't asked for but freely given. Heads turned toward the grand entrance, where a tall man in a custom white tuxedo walked in as though he owned the very ground beneath his feet. His name was Richard Whitmore. To the business world, Richard was the image of success. Born into privilege, his empire stretched across luxury hotels, private jets, and real estate towers. His face was familiar on magazine covers. His quotes filled the pages of financial newspapers, and his arrogance filled every room he stepped into. Richard loved being seen. Unlike Amara, who blended into silence, Richard lived for the spotlight. His shoes gleamed, his watch sparkled, and the smirk on his lips told everyone that he believed he was above them. As he moved through the hall, people rushed to shake his hand. Some laughed at jokes he didn't even finish. Others leaned close hoping to be noticed. Richard thrived on it. He had built his reputation not only on wealth but on power, the kind of power that made people bend, even when they hated him. But there was another truth about Richard Whitmore. Behind his charm and confidence lived something darker: prejudice. Richard never hid his disdain for those he considered beneath him. And in his eyes, people of color never belonged in the same room as him, let alone on the same level of wealth. He carried this arrogance like a crown, mocking quietly, insulting subtly, always making sure others knew their place. "Richard, over here!" someone called out, and Richard strolled toward the center of the hall, throwing back his shoulders as the crowd parted for him. He lifted a glass of champagne handed to him by a waiter, then tapped it with his ring, calling for attention. "My friends," he said with a grin, "tonight we celebrate the true builders of this nation, the ones who carry the weight of prosperity on their shoulders. Billionaires, visionaries, leaders." Applause echoed again. Richard thrived on the sound. He loved being the voice in the room, the one who controlled the narrative. But then his eyes drifted. At the far corner of the hall, he saw Amara sitting quietly at her table. Her dress was modest. Her demeanor was calm. She had no diamonds, no entourage, no hint of wealth to her. To Richard, she was an outsider, a mistake in the guest list, a shadow in a room of light. His smirk widened, because to Richard Whitmore this was an opportunity to remind the room and Amara herself of what he thought she was worth. What Richard didn't know, however, was that tonight would be the beginning of his end. The music swelled softly in the background, violins playing a gentle tune as the guests mingled beneath the chandeliers. Waiters in crisp uniforms glided across the floor, balancing trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres, while laughter and sharp business talk filled the room. Everywhere you looked, wealth was on display. Men compared their imported cars, women flaunted their jewelry, and voices rose with pride over billion-dollar deals. The air was thick with the scent of perfume, ambition, and competition. And in that sea of glittering arrogance sat Amara Johnson. She remained in her corner, sipping water from a simple glass, her eyes observing quietly. She noticed everything, the way people measured each other with glances, the way conversations revolved around power more than purpose. She had been to gatherings like this before, but each time she found herself wondering, did no one here ever learn the value of humility? Across the room, Richard Whitmore basked in attention. He moved from group to group, shaking hands, telling exaggerated stories of his latest business triumphs. The crowd hung on every word, nodding, laughing, clapping as if each sentence was gold. "Richard," one of his associates said, raising a toast, "the empire you've built is unmatched. Truly, you are the king of this city." Richard grinned, lifting his glass high. "Unmatched indeed," he replied. "Because in this game, my friends, only the strong survive. And let's be honest, some people just don't have it in their blood." The words were sharp, cutting through the air like a knife. Some laughed nervously. Others shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. It wasn't the first time Richard had let his prejudice slip. And it wouldn't be the last. A few moments later, Richard's eyes wandered again and landed on Amara, still seated, still calm, still invisible to most but not to him. His smirk returned. He whispered something to the man beside him, and they both laughed. Then, with the confidence of a predator, Richard began walking toward Amara's table. Each step echoed on the marble floor, drawing curious eyes from the guests. Amara didn't flinch. She set her glass down, folded her hands neatly, and waited. She had faced storms before. Whatever this man was about to say or do, she would meet it with the same dignity she carried her entire life. When Richard finally reached her table, he paused, tilting his head slightly as if studying her. The crowd watched in silence, sensing what was about to unfold. And with a mocking smile, Richard broke that silence. "Well," he said loudly, "looks like tonight we let everyone in, didn't we?" A ripple of laughter spread through the room. Some chuckled because they agreed, others because they feared not to. Amara's eyes, however, remained steady, calm, unshaken, and quietly powerful. Richard leaned closer, his voice low but meant to be heard. "Tell me, ma'am, Did you get lost on your way to the staff entrance? Gasps filled the air. The insult was clear, cruel, and deliberate. The crowd turned their eyes to Amara, waiting for her reaction. But she said nothing. She didn't rise. She didn't argue. She didn't even frown. Instead, she simply looked into Richard Whitmore's eyes and smiled. It was a smile so soft, so unbothered, that it unsettled him. Because in that moment, Richard didn't realize it, but the balance of power had already begun to shift. The ballroom had fallen into a strange silence. The kind of silence where every word, every breath, every movement carried weight. Richard Whitmore stood tall at Amara's table, his smirk widening as he sensed the crowd's attention fixed on him. He thrived on moments like this, moments where he could put someone down and remind everyone else of his power. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard said, raising his voice so the entire hall could hear, "I must admit, I'm a little surprised tonight. Here we are, a gathering of the world's finest, men and women who built empires, who shaped industries, who changed the course of history. And yet," he gestured grandly toward Amara, "and yet somehow, someone thought it wise to let in the help." A wave of laughter exploded through the hall. Some guests laughed hard, desperate to stay in Richard's good graces. Others forced nervous chuckles, their eyes darting to Amara, unsure if they should look away. Amara sat still, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression calm as a quiet river. Richard wasn't satisfied. He leaned down closer to her, his voice dripping with mockery. "Tell me, dear, do you even know what kind of event this is? Or did you think there would be free meals served here tonight?" Another round of laughter. Glasses clinked. Even some of the staff at the edges of the room looked down, ashamed for her. But Amara did not flinch. Her eyes held Richard's gaze, unblinking. She didn't raise her voice, didn't defend herself, didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her hurt. Instead, she simply tilted her head slightly, as though she were studying him. The laughter in the room slowly began to fade. Some guests exchanged uneasy glances. There was something in her silence that unsettled them. But Richard pressed on, unwilling to let the moment go. "You see, my friends," he said, turning to the crowd, "this is what happens when standards are lowered. This is what happens when we pretend that everyone belongs in the same room. Some people simply do not." The cruelty of the words hung in the air. For a moment, even the laughter stopped. It was too sharp, too blatant. And yet Amara remained still. Her silence was louder than any argument. In her mind, she remembered the nights she had worked 3 jobs just to pay rent. The years of doors slammed in her face because of her skin color. The humiliation she endured in boardrooms before people learned who she really was. She remembered every wound, every scar, every storm she had survived. But tonight was not the night to reveal any of that. Tonight was the night to let Richard Whitmore dig his own grave. So Amara smiled again. That same soft, mysterious smile that unnerved him earlier. And Richard, though he would never admit it, felt a flicker of discomfort deep inside his chest. For the first time that evening, he felt as though he was the one being studied. The room buzzed with forced laughter and murmurs after Richard's cruel words. Waiters shifted uncomfortably at the edges, and a few guests stared down at their glasses, unwilling to meet Amara's eyes. It seemed the night had already written her role. The outsider, the target, the one humiliated for sport. But what no one realized was that Amara Johnson had been here before. Not this ballroom, not this event, but in this exact moment of being judged, dismissed, and reduced. She knew it all too well, and it never broke her. As the music resumed and Richard strutted back toward the center of the room, Amara sat quietly, her thoughts drifting back through the years. She remembered being a child in a broken neighborhood of Atlanta, raised by a single mother who worked herself to exhaustion to put food on the table. She remembered the stares in school when she wore the same shoes year after year, the whispers when teachers assumed she wasn't smart enough, the jobs she was denied because her skin didn't fit the image of the company. But she also remembered the fire those moments sparked in her. She worked harder than anyone else, reading late into the night by borrowed light, taking shifts others refused, and saving every dollar until her savings turned into seed money, and seed money turned into her first small company. That company failed, but she built another, and another. Each time she rose stronger than before. Each time she was told no, she found her own way to a yes. By the time she reached her 40s, Amara owned corporations across technology, healthcare, and real estate, industries that touched millions of lives. She never forgot where she came from, donating quietly to schools, hospitals, and shelters, lifting others the way she wished someone had lifted her. But through it all, she kept her identity private. She never sought the flashing lights of the media. She never needed to be praised. She built her empire in silence, letting her work, not her ego, speak. And so tonight, as Richard Whitmore mocked her, as strangers laughed at her expense, Amara remained still, because her silence was not weakness. It was discipline. It was control. It was the confidence of someone who knew her worth did not depend on the approval of anyone in that glittering room. The guests saw only a quiet woman with no designer gown and no entourage. What they didn't see was the storm of resilience, the years of sacrifice, and the empire built from nothing. Richard believed he had humiliated her, but Amara knew the truth. In just a short while, he and everyone else in that ballroom would learn who she truly was. And when that moment came, silence would no longer protect her. Silence would become her weapon. The night pressed on. Deals were whispered over glasses of champagne. Laughter spilled across the polished floors, and Richard Whitmore moved like a king among his court. His arrogance filled every corner of the ballroom. And yet, in the far corner, Amara Johnson remained calm, steady, and silent. Then the lights dimmed. A voice echoed from the stage at the front of the hall. The event host, a man in a dark suit with a wide smile. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "thank you for gathering tonight. This summit is not only a celebration of wealth, but of vision. Each year, we honor one individual who has made extraordinary contributions to industry, philanthropy, and society at large. An individual whose work goes beyond numbers. Someone who builds, uplifts, and inspires." The crowd murmured with excitement. Some glanced toward Richard, assuming he would once again be crowned the star of the evening. Richard himself straightened his tuxedo, already preparing his gracious smile. But the host's next words silenced him. "This year, it is our honor to recognize Amara Johnson." The room froze. For a moment, confusion rippled across the hall. Heads turned, searching. And then, slowly, all eyes landed on the woman seated quietly at the corner table. The same woman Richard had mocked, humiliated, and dismissed only an hour earlier. Amara rose from her seat with quiet grace. The crowd gasped, whispers erupting instantly. "Wait, her? Amara Johnson? That's her. She's the one behind Johnson Global Holdings?" Richard's smirk shattered. His glass slipped slightly in his hand as he stared, speechless, watching Amara walk toward the stage. The host continued, "Ms. Johnson's companies span technology, healthcare, and real estate. She has built one of the largest privately held empires in America, valued in the tens of billions. And beyond business, her philanthropy has transformed communities, schools, hospitals, and opportunities for thousands of young people who might otherwise have been left behind. She is, without doubt, one of the most powerful and inspiring leaders of our time." Applause thundered through the room. But it was not the forced applause given to Richard earlier. This was real, genuine, reverent. Amara stepped onto the stage, her step steady, her head held high. She took the microphone, looked out across the glittering sea of faces, and her eyes paused briefly on Richard. His jaw tightened. His face had drained of color. And with a calm smile, she spoke. "I've learned," she said, her voice smooth and measured, "that true power does not come from how loudly we boast or how much we display. True power is in what we build, what we give, and how we treat others." Her words hung in the air, soft but cutting, and many in the crowd shifted in their seats. Amara continued, "For years, I've chosen silence over spectacle, because I never needed to prove myself in a room like this. But tonight, perhaps, it's worth reminding us all. Greatness is never about titles or arrogance. It's about resilience." The applause swelled again, louder, echoing against the high ceilings. Richard's hand tightened around his glass until his knuckles turned white. His empire suddenly didn't feel so solid. His throne suddenly didn't feel so secure. And for the first time in his life, Richard Whitmore realized something terrifying. He had mocked the wrong person. The applause still echoed when Amara stepped down from the stage. Guests surged toward her, eager to shake her hand, eager to be seen in her presence. Reporters whispered into phones, already drafting headlines. "The hidden billionaire revealed," and in the middle of it all, Richard Whitmore stood frozen. His once commanding presence shrank with every second, his face pale, his smirk gone. For the first time in years, he was not the center of attention. He was invisible, forgotten, but his humiliation was only the beginning, because Amara Johnson did not believe in loud revenge. She believed in silent, precise justice. As the night went on, she moved with grace, quietly speaking with investors, partners, and industry leaders, many of whom had long grown tired of Richard's arrogance. They had followed him because he seemed untouchable, because his empire looked strong. But now, in the shadow of Amara's presence, his image cracked. By midnight, the cracks widened. One of Richard's largest investors announced they were shifting billions in funding to Amara's ventures. A second firm followed, then a third. In hushed conversations across the ballroom, Richard's name became poison, his reputation exposed for the arrogance it was. "Why follow Whitmore?" someone whispered. "When Johnson is the true leader?" Phones buzzed, deals collapsed, contracts dissolved. News outlets caught the story instantly, broadcasting the shift live. Stockholders panicked. Shares in Whitmore Enterprises began to plummet before the night was even over. Richard felt it like a storm crashing over him. His phone vibrated relentlessly. Panicked calls from board members, frantic texts from advisors. He tried to smile, tried to act unbothered, but sweat gathered at his brow. His empire, worth billions, was crumbling in hours. And Amara? She never raised her voice, never boasted. She simply continued to move gracefully through the crowd, her silence more powerful than any declaration. At one point, she walked past Richard. She didn't even pause. She didn't look at him, didn't acknowledge his existence. And yet, that silence cut deeper than any insult. By dawn, Richard's name was trending for all the wrong reasons. His stock value had nosedived. His partners had abandoned him. His empire was no longer his. And all of it collapsed in a single night. Not by force, not by anger, but by the quiet, unshakable power of a woman he once dared to humiliate. The sun had barely risen over New York City when the final blow landed. News networks blared with breaking headlines. Whitmore Empire crumbles overnight. Investors flee, fortune lost. Johnson emerges as powerhouse leader. By morning, Richard Whitmore's billion-dollar empire was gone. His companies were stripped of investors, his stock had collapsed, and his name, once spoken with respect, had become a symbol of arrogance destroyed. But the most crushing moment for Richard did not come from the headlines. It came hours later, in that same ballroom where his humiliation had begun. Most of the guests had left, but a handful remained, buzzing about the historic fall they had just witnessed. Richard, disheveled and broken, sat slumped in a chair, his tuxedo wrinkled, his phone lifeless in his hand. The man who once walked like a king now looked like a ghost. And then Amara entered. She walked with the same grace as before, her steps calm, her presence commanding without effort. The room quieted instantly. Richard lifted his head, his eyes bloodshot, his pride shattered. For the first time in his life, Richard Whitmore stood on shaking legs, and then fell to his knees. "Please," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Amara, I was wrong. I didn't know who you were. I didn't." Amara raised her hand, silencing him. Her eyes softened, but her expression remained firm. "You didn't need to know who I was," she said quietly. "You only needed to know that I was human. That should have been enough." The words hung in the air, piercing deeper than any insult ever could. Richard lowered his head, ashamed, unable to meet her gaze. Amara stepped closer, her voice calm but resolute. "Empires rise and fall, Richard. But respect lasts forever. You chose arrogance. You chose cruelty. And now you see what those choices build." He begged again, but Amara did not respond with cruelty. She did not mock him the way he had mocked her. She simply turned, her dignity intact, and walked away. As she reached the doors of the ballroom, she paused and looked back one final time. "I don't need to destroy you, Richard," she said softly. "You've done that yourself." And with that, she left. The doors closed behind her, and the silence that followed was heavy. Guests exchanged glances, realizing they had just witnessed more than the fall of a billionaire. They had witnessed the quiet, undeniable triumph of dignity over arrogance. Amara Johnson never raised her voice. She never needed to, because true strength does not shout. True strength stands tall, even in silence.